and the other organizers of the conference. And I just have to say, Adrian and I got here on Monday, and Annie and Naomi took their very valuable time to take us out to see a farm in the countryside and spend all day driving, and we just really appreciated the time and the generosity that you've shown in hosting us. So thanks very much for that. So I've been asked to come and talk about how farmers in Canada are building alternative land tenure systems on the ground. Really in our context, in order to affect some significant change in our food system. I'm just give you a warning. I'm a lawyer and a legal academic, and so my perspective is really going to kind of ask about legal structure. At least it's going to start there, and I'm going to talk about, I think, a theme that has run through, in my understanding, the last couple of days, which is this kind of interplay between, some of the formal ways that we might think about land reform, land tenure change, and how to match that or think about that with respect to what's really happening on the ground. And the perspective that I'm taking, both as a legal researcher and as a board member of this organization called the National Farmers Foundation in Canada, which I'll talk to you a little bit about, are really trying to sort of think about this question of land tenure change, of alternative land tenure systems from this kind of ground up perspective. And I'll try to reflect a little bit on what that's meant for us, and then really to try to focus on some of the kind of high level takeaways. But I think at the heart, and I think Olivia made this point yesterday in her presentation, which I really like, in this idea that property is still being made. And I think that is really the lesson, in some sense, at the highest level, that we're taking away from an understanding of going out and talking to farmers and gathering some data on some of this stuff, is this idea that, in fact, these land tenure systems, as Naomi said, bigger certainly from ideas of ownership and property, are really being made in practice. And we're trying to understand what that means and what the policy implications of that really are. Okay, so here is the outline for the brief talk today, and I will try to leave then some time for questions at the end. I'll give you a bit of just a sense of the Canadian context, and I think this will really be one with many of the other contexts we've talked about the last couple of days, and a bit of background on this organization called the National Farmers Foundation. And then I'm going to paint you a bit of a portrait of ALTS in Canada based on some data gathering we've been doing in the attempt to build a kind of national inventory around these systems across the country. Then 3, I'll focus on what we've learned. And I'm a bit sheepish about this part, to be honest with you, because we are really just early on in trying to make sense of what we're learning. We're still in the process of gathering information, of using that as the basis to go and talk to some farmers and others who are involved in all of this. But I'll try to give you the kind of evolving understanding as we see it right now. And then I want to come back to at the very end, which I think is the other way to go and frame my comments today, which is to really ask about the role of a national third sector model. And this is the question that the National Farmers Foundation is asking ourselves and asking our partners and collaborators, is where is the third sector, in our particular context in Canada, and what role could a national organization play in affecting or facilitating change? All right, so just to kind of start from the very biggest picture, I'll talk about ALTS. That's the acronym we're throwing around, Alternative Agricultural Land Tenure Systems. As Naomi, I think, helpfully kind of framed, we are thinking about these as systems, institutional systems of rules, but also of norms, increasingly, that sometimes fit and sometimes don't with the formal rules, social practices, processes of social learning, that certainly engage dimensions of ownership and other kinds of property rights or entitlements that go along with land, but to think about that as part of a system. And again, this is going to be kind of really fundamental to the big takeaway that we are sort of developing on these things, which is more about thinking of them as dynamic systems than as some kind of static entities that we should understand or seek to understand at some particular point in time. So for the ALTS in Canada, the context really is about food systems change. And that is really, I think, overall what's driving our interest in alternative systems, both as the Farmers Foundation, as a research perspective, and from the farmers on the ground, is that they're trying to find systems that support food systems transformation. In a context in which our food system is really failing us quite dramatically. I'm in Nova Scotia. We had, I think still in the most extensive drought in our recorded history. And this is in the Maritimes where we generally get a lot of rain. And so this is really freaking us out. And we are, I think, then paying more attention to the role of land tenure system change in all of this. So it's about agroecological practices, and as a big, pillar aspect of agroecology, thinking about land and land governance. It's about crucially diverse and equitable land access. That is just to say not only what's happening on the land, but who's farming it, and recognition that we need to change that landscape or that dimension as part of the agroecological landscape altogether. And it's about community-based decision-making and collective action, and partly collective action as shared resources, as ways to get farmers on the land in the face of an access crisis. But it's also about empowering communities in whatever form they take in these systems to make decisions and to engage in collective action. Okay, so just very briefly on the context then, drivers, again, really no, I think, surprise here. This is really largely, in large part, when we get down to questions about land and land access, it's about demographics. The average age of the Canadian farmer is 56 years. We expect 40% of Canadian farmers to retire in the next decade. And so this seems, both like a tremendous period of challenge, but also opportunity, right? The land is going to be changing hands in the next 10 years, and we need to find a way to meet that challenge, in the face of, pretty dramatic inaffordability. And when I hear about some of the land prices in Europe, our numbers maybe don't look quite so dramatic, maybe somewhere on average in Canada around 5,000 Canadian dollars a hectare. But that's an order of magnitude over the last 30 or 40 years, from $500 an acre or hectare to in the mid 1980s, to tens of that today. And so there has been some real dramatic change, much of that really just in the last few years, which I think is sort of driving the urgency around the crisis. And then you heard from Annette yesterday. Annette is the chair of our board of the National Farmers Foundation, so we were closely together. Dynamics of farmland financialization are certainly an important part of this picture and a big part of this concern. Particularly, I would just say in this current era, I think in which there is a real sense in our current era of economic uncertainty, and this is hit hard in the Trumpian era in Canada, in which all of our trade and other relations are really disrupted, that folks are looking for safe havens for their money, and that this is coming for us as Annette's described, but I think is not going away. Okay, we also talked a little bit about the context of Indigenous land rights, and so I'll just mention this briefly. All conversations, I think it's fair to say, around land tenure change in Canada are framed by these conversations around Indigenous land justice, around histories of settler colonialism in Canada. But I want to make the important point that it isn't only, and I think there's an evolving nature to this conversation when we talk about land tenure change, isn't just about returning ownership to Indigenous peoples or Indigenous communities. That's an important part of the conversation. But increasingly, we are thinking about this in terms of governance and sovereignty. That is just to say, ownership is one thing, yes, but communities, I think nations are demanding that they are put in positions of being able to make decisions about governance of the land. And sometimes that means holding title, and sometimes it doesn't. And so, when we talk about tenure change, we talk about agricultural tenure change, we think about relationships with Indigenous nations. Much of the work, again, on the ground is really working out those terms of kind of coexistence. Sometimes less about disrupting the status of title and more about thinking about, we might say sort of deeper questions around sovereignty, and increasing this idea of small T tree relations. Much of the conversation historically has been about sort of nation to nation relationships in Canada, the Canadian state and First Nations, but farmers in particular, and we're seeing this in the work that we're doing, are really asking about what we might call small T tree relations. That is, say, not as between state entities or national entities, but as between farmers as individuals or as collective entities in terms of farmers organizations or communities in Indigenous communities, and what those kinds of relationships actually look like. Okay, so I won't say too much more about that. We are learning about that. I don't have a good example of a tenure model that is realizing all those ambitions, but it's certainly important framing the context. And then law and policy, and I think similar to maybe what Adam was saying in the US, or maybe this is more so even for us in Canada, we don't have a comprehensive or even anything that starts to look like a comprehensive framework for land reform, certainly for land justice more broadly, either at the federal or provincial levels. Annette gave you a flavor yesterday about some historical experiments in terms of the Saskatchewan Land Bank, which we've seen kind of interventions, some various frameworks to try to prevent foreign ownership and consolidation, but nothing in the way of comprehensive land reform. And it really does shape, of course, the nature of the conversation that we have, vis-a-vis something like what's going on in Scotland. Okay, National Farmers Foundation, very quickly. We are a farmer-led national charitable organization. We've been around since about the 1980s, but for most of our history, really up until the last couple of years, we've been a kind of foundation partner to an organization called the National Farmers Union. And now, in my conversation the last couple of days and talking to others about the role of national farmers unions or farmers unions more generally, it's a very different organization in Canada. It's basically a progressive farmers advocacy policy organization at a national level, not a conventional kind of farmers interest group. And so the Farmers Foundation has kind of acted as a foundation funder or flow-through organization over most of its history for the NFU, which has certainly shaped its politics and its aims. But in the kind of scope of some changing questions around or parameters around tax law and so forth in Canada, we're no longer needed in that role as much as we used to be. And so we've really been through a period of rethinking really what our mission is. And we've decided that what we at least want our mission to be is to be a kind of national organization that facilitates land transition, supports alternative tenure arrangements, and we're trying to figure out how to do that. So I'm going to come back to that at the very end, just to release some reflections into questions that we're asking ourselves. And really, in some ways, it's captured by this question here. Is there a role for us or for an entity like us as a kind of national third sector leader in Canada? And this question of, what is the role of the third sector in land reform or land transition, largely in the absence of, legislative interventions or larger policy factors. Okay, so here's the quick portrait of ALTS in Canada. The idea here is that the development of these alternative tenure arrangements has been really highly localized and heavily decentralized across the country. So we don't have, a really good bird's eye view at all as to, where these things come from or how they've evolved or what's driving them. And so we really have decided that we need a better picture of what's going on in the ground. And so, that's involving a couple of components right now. We're building this national inventory of alternative land tenure systems. And that's been a challenging project for lots of reasons that I'm sure folks in this room can understand in terms of trying to figure out how to define these things, how to develop some selection criteria for the ones that we want to capture and understand how to model them in a way that we can collect them in a database. And then, think about, who's going to be using this, farmers, policymakers, and others. And then to supplement that, we've been out talking to farmers about their experiences and doing a bit of comparative research, particularly in the US, to link back to some of Adam's comments. And I'll maybe pick that up again at the end, because I think much of our context relates to what's happening to the south of us. Okay, so here's just like a brief snapshot or visual in terms of the data we've got right now. Just in terms of geographic distribution, we've probably got about 100 different entities that we've identified through various means in the inventory right now. As you can see, they're pretty heavily localized on the West Coast in British Columbia and in Ontario in central Canada. Spottier kind of development certainly in the prairie provinces where Annette was talking about from yesterday on the East Coast where I am. And we have one example in the north in the Yukon. There is a certain geographic distribution pattern to these in which there seems to be a certain concentration in certain areas of the country. Some of that has to do with, kind of provincial legal context, like in BC, there's a agricultural land reserve that facilitates some of this. In Ontario, some of the peri-urban development is really driving some of these questions around land protection and therefore land access. Okay, and this is the part that I'm going to focus most of the rest of my comments on for today, and it's really about these kind of diverse models that we're identifying. And I'm going to start with this question of models, and then I'm going to tell you a few stories about some of the farmers we talked to kind of trouble this idea about kind of legal structure and legal models. So, the kind of archetypes that we found are on this kind of page here. Regional trusts. That really come out of this history of farmland conservation trusts. That is to say, not organizations that are involved in really changing, land ownership or title or even tenure really more broadly, but have been holders, for example, of conservation easements or farmland easements on privately held land in order to, protect those as farmlands in the face of things like development pressures, predominantly, maybe to enforce some ecological easements for certain kinds of farming practices. And some of these organizations, like the Ontario Farmland Trust, that has been long involved in this, or in my neck of the woods, the Annapolis Valley Farmland Trust, are starting to transition to thinking more about kind of landholding trusts and getting more directly engaged in questions of land access, where they are buying up farmland, having it donated to them where it's available, and then making that available to farmers on different terms. Different from community trusts or community land trusts, which are sort of more bottom-up enterprises that we're starting to see develop. And I've been involved in helping to build one of these in Nova Scotia, where you basically have a nonprofit entity developed, designed to hold the title to the land, and then pretty complicated leasehold agreements, ground lease agreements that are designed to build leaseholder equity for farmers while protecting against speculative investment in the land, and have a kind of baked in community governance structure and with representative roles on the board or otherwise for different interests in the broader community, among farmers, among the landholding entity, and so forth. Okay, and these have a longer history, certainly in the US, increasingly in Canada, in urban housing contexts. There hasn't been very many examples in agriculture, and one of the big projects of these is to sort of think about, can we map or transition or translate those from urban affordability, housing affordability, into kind of the affordability of agricultural land. Social purpose trusts, something we're just starting to learn about. This is specific to Quebec, where they have a civil law system, different from the common law system in the rest of the country, where they are leveraging this thing that they have and we don't have in the rest of Canada, called social purpose trusts, which is different from the way we talk about other trusts, which aren't, from a lawyer's perspective at least, really trusts. They don't have a trustee or beneficiaries in the normal course. But in Quebec, these social purposes have this more formal trust structure as a way to enshrine very particular and specific social objectives into a trust that can actually exist in perpetuity. Cooperatives, you'll see some examples of cooperatives here, quite popular. These are really focused on kind of horizontal member-based or democratic governance. Certainly can be landholding entities or as tenant entities, and they operate within well-defined statutory regimes, which is often a driver for entities to develop in this manner. And sometimes there's a real choice: do you build a community land trust or do you build a cooperative? They might look very similar in their operation, in their ultimate effect, but sometimes given the statutory basis for these cooperatives, we don't have for community land trusts, it's often an important route for folks. And then there are some others that are just really starting to emerge. We don't have good concrete examples, but there's been some conversation, a few experiments into these employee ownership trusts as something that's developed again outside the agricultural context, but is being mapped to agricultural land in some ways. Land condominium, which is an interesting one, we call them a bare land condominium, where you take 100 acres and divide it up into 10 plots. You have basically a fee title to each of the individual plots, but you share the common features and common spaces of the land. But this all operates under the condominium legislation that's been developed for, high rise or something like that in urban environments. So again, kind of creative, interesting solutions. Okay, so here's the upshot of all this. ALTS frequently employ mix and match design strategies. Formal models appear less important than what works on the ground. So as much as my lawyer self would love to have the nice neat boxes to be able to say, what do you want? Here's the model we can build for you. Here are the precedents that we can provide. When we actually go out and look at what's happening and what folks are doing, there's a lot of mixing and matching. And it's very difficult actually to sort of shoehorn these into particular boxes. And I think that's a good lesson for us in terms of how we think about developing, supporting these things and so forth. Okay, so here are the policy pieces that I've been asked to talk about and the kind of big takeaways. And as I said, these are really emerging understandings. I'll try to give you a few stories to back these up. But really, there's kind of 4 key points. One, and this relates to this idea of thinking less about models and static systems to think about ALTS as transition pathways, or I guess you could call them dynamic systems. And this is really in part a question about structure versus social learning. Many of the stories we're hearing is about the ideas that these communities have, groups have, farmers and others that get together and try to build these things. They have a particular structure in mind that accords the set of aims, but those are rapidly evolving in the course of working these out in practice. And there's a tremendous amount of social learning that is happening in the course of these. And so actually thinking about these and starting from the get-go to think about these as transition pathways, I think is a really important lesson for making them successful in the long run, and that there is long time horizons associated with that. We have maybe too much focus on startup funding, startup capacity building, and so forth, and don't pay as much attention to these critical intervention points. 2, farmers want the means to build shared equity to sustain their livelihoods, keep land accessible, and realize community benefit. And frankly, sometimes these things are in tension. And farmers, again, on the ground are trying to work out how to sort of navigate all of these ways in which they are investing in land, investing in improvements, as it were, on the land, planning forward, for when they're not going to be on the land anymore, operating in their current context while also keeping an eye on the next generation to ensure that that land stays accessible going forward. Land access is about safe and inclusive rural spaces. We started off with a frame around, tenure security that, again, thinks a lot about the legal rules and supports that are available to get farmers onto the land. And some of the stories we're hearing is that that's important, certainly, but it's not the only thing that's important when we think about security. And for folks who are coming from marginalized communities, from those who've been traditionally excluded from agriculture, coming into rural spaces, they need those spaces to be safe and inclusive, and we need to design models that ensure that's going to happen. And we need to make sure that the leadership of these are representative of the communities that they serve. And then finally, both short and long-term success of ALTS mean planning for the next transition. I mentioned that a little bit, kind of connected this idea of transition pathways and building equity. But I think those that have been around the longest and that seem, at least from our perspective right now, the most successful are those that have thought forward not only to their, making their current context work, but also to how to transition that, into the next transition pathway. Okay, so then again, just a few stories in the times that I've got left. And these are, our interviews at this point have all been confidential, and so these are just sort of pseudonyms for the farms. This first one called Common Roots Farm, sort of told us this idea or asked this question: who still knows how to organize a barn raising? And they have developed there in the West Coast, are interested in market gardening predominantly and small scale vegetable provision for local markets. They developed this kind of complicated structure of a kind of co-op to co-op. So co-op owns the land. They've been able to get together a group of about 8 to 10 folks, form a cooperative entity, acquire some land in their locality, and then created another co-op entity as the kind of farming operation, which the agricultural aspects of that land are actually rented to. And they had some very particular reasons for that in the story that they told us, which was really about trying to kind of identify sort of membership roles or communities within their larger sort of structure, so that farmers could have kind of control over and decision-making around, as well as, hold kind of stakes in the farming enterprise, but that they were also making provisions for others who wanted to come and live on the land but not farm, be part of the landowning co-op and have a membership role in that entity while not having decision-making power in the agricultural enterprise. So I'm not going to, try to untangle all of the weeds there, all just to say the story that they told us in the course of trying to work that out in practice really was one in which the structure had to really evolve. They made lots of mistakes, wish they had done things differently. And the key lesson, on this idea about barn raising that they had learned was that there was so much social learning, relearning that was involved in making this work. Really with any structure that they had developed, that they were increasingly pouring more of their efforts into thinking how to do that social learning and how structures could really support that. That is just to say how they could really learn to work together in these enterprises, resolve disputes, set expectations. And so they're playing around with these governance tools around probationary periods for folks who want to newly come into the co-op or to the enterprise, defining different membership roles. And they really stress to us the importance of feedback loops in these learning processes, that you have to have ways to kind of baked into your structure to sort of learn lessons, to have your members and other stakeholders provide feedback so those can be easily reflected. Okay, and so I think the policy lesson on this one then is, to, again, on this idea of thinking about these as transition pathways or dynamic systems, is to identify and target support to critical intervention points, kind of along those pathways, right? To think about this not just as a, kind of startup support and otherwise, but to think about what are all of the points, down the road potentially that these tenure agents are going to need support on. And how do we identify them, right? How do we get the feedback from those who are actually doing it on the ground? And how do we think about supporting those as a kind of ongoing process? Okay, here's one called Heartland Community Homestead. And this was really a story and a lesson about housing and the importance of housing in all of these, despite the focus maybe initially for many of these on, kind of agricultural tenure and what are you going to grow or what are you going to pasture on those lands. Much of the hard work and much of the distribution of benefit actually came in the form of thinking about housing. And so this is a story actually of public lands, federal lands that were leased to a cooperative enterprise, which the farmers we talked to. And as it turned out, one of the lessons that SCOP learned was this federal entity, was doing this in various different ways, making land accessible to farmers, but actually had extremely restrictive housing policies, all the way to renters in the houses on these lands, requiring them to bear the costs of upkeep, of improvements, of renovations, but not being able to take any of that equity or investment back out of the house in any way. And so they were sort of starting from a position and an ongoing conversation with the landholder in this case about how to make those policies more flexible, certainly, so that this was viable for them at all. And then thinking forward to moving to a point in which housing itself could serve as an equity building device. And that in farmland, there are not many other places for farmers, particularly who are renting, to build equity housing using these ground leases in which rent holders, leaseholders own the improvements or can at least take equity in the improvements, even if they don't own title to the land, is a really important way for them to make investments to build this equity. But there's a lot of negotiation in that. And this is one of the lessons from the community land trusts who have been, I think, understanding this for a lot longer than we have in the farming context, is that, working out, the formulas by which you accrue or acquire that equity, how to split investment in improvements versus, appreciation in the value of those lands and knock-on effects to the value of those improvements all have to be worked out, often on paper, as a way to sort of make sure that everyone is on the same page for these things. This one, Next Egg Collective, incubating access for BIPOC, that's say Black, Indigenous, people of color, queer and women identifying farmers, which then includes trans folks. This was a way, an incubator farm that was developed, again, this kind of co-op and hybrid, co-op nonprofit hybrid that shared ownership of the land, and then provided, we might call sort of medium-term startup leases that were meant really to just get farmers who had no access to land on the land to develop their farming business, but with the explicit intention that they are then going to move on elsewhere. And so this wasn't a model that really was developed for long-term tenure security or some of these other kind of investment challenges that we've been talking about, but had a very sort of targeted intervention in ensuring that farming, that land access was more available to those who had been conventionally excluded from agriculture. And as I said at the overview slide, the lesson here that the folks that we talked to on this enterprise are telling us that tenant security, which in an incubator model, has like a different context for folks who were trying to access this land, was really about creating safe and inclusive rural spaces, as well as affordability. Not that affordability wasn't important, but that in the governance structure and in thinking about the governance structure, there was a real focus on creating, sort of safety and inclusivity to ensure that these folks were willing to come in the first place, that they felt safe and secure and being able to develop their business model, use the land, and then hopefully move on from there to a longer term context. Okay, last one. This one I called New Generations Farm, and this is the lesson about planning for the next transition. Here's one in which a land trust was renting to a kind of private leasehold in a farm business, and they had, separate from any provisions around ground leasing that allowed the farmer here to build equity in housing or other improvements, they created this farmer reserve pool that basically a reserve fund that's managed by the land trust through things like remortgaging or earmarking on capital improvements. And the idea here was to create a way for the existing farmer to sort of transition their current farm business, one that had been quite successful, and that they were worried if they were then to turn that over when they wanted to retire and move off the land to a new farmer, that the next generation simply couldn't afford. And so the land trust itself was developing these financial mechanisms to kind of think forward to facilitating that transition, to ensuring that the land, that maybe even the transition of the farm business on that land remained somewhat accessible, and really at the end of the day, try to figure out how to balance these needs, right? Of incumbent farmers who wanted to have some stake certainly in their business, some ability to think forward what's going to happen after they're finished farming, and certainly though with a keen attention and eye to making sure that that's still accessible going forward. Okay, I won't talk too much about these, but just to give a nod to some of these other financial, social, cultural factors. I think it's hard to kind of know how much or how to identify specifically what cultural factors are driving us in Canada. But I think overall, this idea that, we've talked for a long time in Canada about multiculturalism and how to make sort of big space for multiculturalism within, let's say the kind of Canadian cultural legal framework to one of legal pluralism. And this kind of comes back to questions of Indigenous sovereignty and so forth. That is to say, we're kind of increasingly recognizing that we need to do better, think more about and develop a better understanding and operation of a kind of coexistence of legal systems. And here, normally we're talking about indigenous legal orders and trying to think about land governance and how to fit farmland access into that. Networks of professional expertise, we have trouble finding lawyers, certainly, and others who can build this stuff. They simply don't know how. And how we're going to train those folks up or get them knowledge or sort of translate knowledge from the realm of, even in the legal world, professionals, tax lawyers, corporate lawyers, wills and estates lawyers. Just to build one of these things, we found we needed like 5 different legal expertise to put together, and that wasn't counting the accountants and others that we needed to help. So that's a challenge in trying to put those networks together. It's been important. Credit, investment, and insurance. Finding banks to lend to folks. Local credit unions seem to be an important part of this picture, but certainly we have a highly consolidated banking sector, for example, in Canada. Really difficult to get these large organizations to understand these alternative tenure arrangements, certainly to finance them, and similar with finding insurance and otherwise. And then one of the big challenges for us at the NFF, we've been going through the last couple of years, is really this question of charities regulation. It's very difficult to register a charity in Canada that is doing exactly this kind of work. In particular, holding land as like land trust, renting it out to farmers, or having another tenure arrangement that is basically on terms of below market rates. That's regarded as providing what's called in Canadian law an undue benefit to private parties, and that's a no-no in Canadian charities law. So finding a way to overcome some of those barriers, convincing the tax authorities that we can do this work while still maintaining some of the important benefits that come with charitable registration is a really important hurdle. Okay, so this comes back to this question of what is the NFF's role in all of this? We are trying to think about how to support the development of these local, the more localized or regionalized land tenure systems, whether or not we ourselves will kind of operate as a land trust or maybe kind of a flow-through organization to acquire lands and then to establish local entities to actually govern them, because it seems quite impossible to do that work at the national level, extending networks of support, acting as a policy champions for policy or legal reforms. All of these are sort of in the mix. And as I say, we're looking to the US, where some of these national entities in the nature of agrarian trust or the Farmers Land Trust are operating to do some of this work. And we're learning that the kind of multi-level collaboration that they demonstrate there can work, but there are some also real challenges. They have a real history of kind of competition with other types of land trusts, and in their current moment, some real vulnerability to the political changes in that country that have exposed how difficult it is to rely so heavily on the third sector in the absence of larger political and democratic support. Okay, I think I've probably gone longer than I wanted to, so I'll end there in case there's questions. Thanks for your time.